Hello, welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 43 of ASP.NET GridView tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about nesting GridView controls. In part 32 of the ASP.NET GridView tutorial, we discussed about displaying a GridView control inside another GridView control. So here the outer GridView is department's GridView control, and then we have a list of employees belonging to that department being displayed in another GridView control. So effectively here we have employees GridView control nested inside departments GridView control. After watching this video, a lot of my YouTube subscribers has asked me this question: how to nest three or more GridView controls. Here we are just nesting two GridView controls, but if I have to nest three or more GridView controls, then how do I do that? Obviously I have an example here. So let's say I want to nest countries within continents and then cities within countries GridView control. So if you look at the example that we have here, the outer GridView control is the continents GridView control. At the moment we can see Asia continent, and then all the countries belonging to that continent are displayed in another GridView control, as you can see here. Okay, and then the cities belonging to each country are displayed in its own GridView control. So effectively, cities GridView control is nested inside countries, and countries are nested inside the continents GridView control. Obviously, the data for these three GridView controls is coming from these three different tables: TBL, continents, countries, and cities. If you need the SQL script to create and populate these tables, it's available on my blog. So if you look at part 34 of the ASP.NET GridView tutorial, you have the SQL script here. So create table script and then insert statements. Okay, now if you need the blog URL, it's there on the slide. So once you visit this URL, on the right hand side you have a link here, free ASP.NET GridView tutorial. So once you click on that link, you can see all the text version of the videos, and then you'll have the scripts and code samples related to every video here. Okay, so copy the script from part 34 of the ASP.NET GridView tutorial. So obviously, to retrieve that data from the database, I have created respective data access layer class files. So to retrieve continents information, I have continent data access layer. Again, this data access layer code is copied from another video that we have discussed before, part 35 of the ASP.NET GridView tutorial. Okay, so here on this part you can see the continent data access layer, country data access layer, etc. Okay, I'm not going to go into the details of implementing these data access layers. We already spoken about them in part 35, but if you look at that, they're pretty straightforward. I have the continent class itself, and then within continent data access layer we have get all continents method, which is basically returning a list of continent objects. Similarly, I have countries data access layer. So here we have the country class, and then the country data access layer, which has got this method get countries by continent ID. You give it the continent ID, this method is going to return all the countries belonging to that continent. Similarly, cities data access layer has got get cities by country ID. You give it the country ID, it's going to return all the cities belonging to that country. Alright, so if you look at what we need, within the continents GridView control, I need continent ID and continent name, and along with that I need the list of countries as well belonging to that continent. But at the moment, if you look at the continent data access layer, it has just got continent ID and continent name. We need countries property as well. So let's go ahead and create countries property. So public, and what is this property going to return? It has to return me the list of countries belonging to that specific continent. So this is going to be a list of country objects, and then I'm going to call this property as countries, and then for this property I'm just going to have the get accessor. Okay, so for the given continent ID, I want the list of countries. So how am I going to get the list of countries? In countries data access layer, we have got this method get countries by continent ID. I'm going to make use of this method. All you need to do is give it the continent ID, and you're going to get the countries belonging to that continent, so which is present inside country data access layer. So let's use that country data access layer dot get countries by continent, and to this method we need to pass the continent ID. Which continent ID? Whatever is the continent ID of the object that I'm going to create. So here I'm just going to say this dot continent ID. That's it. So this is our first change that we need to do. So obviously we have to use the return keyword because that's what we want to return back. Alright, so that's continent data access layer. And another thing is, if you look at the countries, grid view control, we display country ID, country name, and continent ID. And in addition to that, we should be displaying cities as well. Okay, but if you look at the country data access layer here, we only have country ID, country name, and continent ID, but we need all the cities belonging to this specific country. Okay, so let's go ahead and add cities property here. So this is going to return a list of city objects, and I'm going to call that cities. And again, this property is going to have just get accessor, and I can make use of city data access layer. City data access layer dot get cities by country ID, and to this pass the country ID. That's it. So these are the simple modifications that we have to do for our data access layer class files. And once we are done with that, let's build the solution. Okay, now let's turn our attention to our web form. So this is again important. We need to configure our grid view controls. So basically here we need, the outer grid view control is going to display continent information, continent ID, continent name, and the list of countries belonging to that continent. So let me drag and drop a grid view control onto this web form, and let's auto format that. Okay, so if you look at this grid view control, we want continent ID, continent name, and countries. Continent ID, continent name can be bound columns, but countries, I'm going to make use of a template field so that I can drag and drop a grid view control into the item template of the template field. So effectively, for the outermost grid view control, we need 3 bound fields. So I'm going to click on this grid view tasks button, click on edit columns, and then the first thing is uncheck auto generate fields. We don't want the columns to be auto generated within the grid view control. So I want 2 bound fields and 1 template field. Okay, so the first bound field is going to display continent ID, the second one continent name. Data fields are also going to be the same things. So continent, that's going to be the header text, and data field is also going to be continent ID. The second bound field is going to be continent name, that's the header text, and data field is also going to be continent name. The third one is going to display countries, so I'm just going to give it a header text of countries. Since this is a template field, it will not have data field. We need to define an item template for the template field. So at this point I'm going to click OK. So our grid view control has 3 columns. The first 2 are the bound fields, the third one is the template field. Now we need to edit templates, and then within the item template I'm going to use a grid view control, and I'm going to auto format this as well, and then set the scheme to brown sugar so that the headings will appear in brown color. Alright, with that, now look at this. This grid view control that we have in the template field, this should bind to the countries property of the continent object. So if you remember, in continent data access layer we have defined countries property. So the grid view control here should bind to the countries property. Okay, so I'm going to specify that data binding on our web form. So here the first thing that I'm going to do is click on edit data bindings, and I'm going to bind, look at this, I'm going to set this data source property to bind to countries property. Okay, click OK. So we are done with data bindings, but then another important thing here, in the countries grid view control, I want country ID, country name, continent ID. These 3 can be the bound fields, but the 4th column should display the list of cities belonging to that country. So obviously the 4th field has to be another template field. So in total I need 4 columns within this grid view control, 3 of them bound fields and the 4th one a template field. So let's do that. Let's click on this grid view control, edit columns. The first thing, uncheck auto generate fields, and then I'm going to add 1, 2, 3 bound fields and one template field. So the first field is going to display country ID. That's the header text, and data field is going to be country ID, and the second one is going to display country name, and the header text is going to be, data field is going to be country name. The third column is going to display continent ID. The data field is also going to be continent ID, and the template field header text is going to be cities. So let's just specify the header text here. Okay, so that's the template field within the second grid view control, that is the countries grid view control, that is nested inside continents grid view control. So let's click OK now. So this is the second nested grid view control. So you can see the ID here, grid view 2. Now I need to define the template, item template for this cities template column. So to do that, click on edit templates, and then I'm going to drag and drop another grid view control. So this is the third grid view control, and I'm going to set the auto format for this one also to brown sugar. And then the only thing that we need to do here is, look at this, within cities we want to display city ID, city name, country ID. We can let the columns to be auto generated, but then we need to define the data source, meaning the innermost grid view control should be bound to cities property of the country object. So if you look at the country data access layer, this country object has got cities property, and to that property we need to bind the innermost grid view control. Let's do that. Edit data bindings, data source. To this one we need to bind cities property. Alright, so we are done specifying all the configuration at the grid view control levels. So let's end template editing for the second grid view control as well. So we are done. So now let's go ahead and run this, and everything should fall in place automatically. Okay, look at this, we don't have anything displayed on the web form, and that's understandable because we just defined the templates. Obviously within the code behind file, the most important thing is to invoke continent data access layer. So I'm going to call continent data access layer dot get all continents, which is going to act as the data source for our grid view 1 control. And grid view 1 dot data bind. With that, now we should have the data displayed within the 3 grid view controls. So you can see that I have the continents grid view control, within which we have countries, and then within each country we have the cities grid view control. And one thing here is, if you look at the output, it's not exactly how it is in the slide here. The width of the grid view controls is not properly aligned. If that's if you want to correct that, all you need to set is the width property of the inner grid view controls. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to actually go into the HTML source, and I'm going to set the width property of the countries and cities grid view control. So here we have country grid view control. I'm going to set the width of this one to 100%, and for the cities grid view control as well. So that's grid view 2, and this is grid view 3. Let's set the width for this one. Okay, so with that, if we run this, the widths of all the controls should be properly aligned, and now this is exactly similar to what we have on the slide. Okay, so we have continents, within that we have countries, and then we have cities. Alright, on this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.